Okay, look, I know that title sounds very bloated, but it's true. Mascot Horror has been around for a while. Many people have done their best to take the reins and make it their own for better or for worse. However, there's a single problem that has plagued the genre for a long time. And that's not just a problem for Mascot Horror either. Every genre has its problems. Many people don't like point-and-click games for having obscure answers that make you look at a walkthrough and then feel stupid. MMORPGs are notorious for being near impossible to progress at certain points without grinding or forking over cash. Collectathons are often criticized because most developers hide objects nonsensically, often without rewarding the player for true exploration. But you never hear people groan when they hear about a new collectathon or point-and-click popping up. And that's because there's something tied very heavily with the genre. Although a lot of people talk about the lore, and that's part of what I'm talking about, that doesn't explain why Garten of Banban Reincarnated was able to take the exact same concept and story and become so beloved that it inspired the creator to make their own Mascot Horror game. Or why FNAF went from being a series so interesting that it changed the game for horror entirely, only for it to now be considered ruined by many older fans. Well, first things first, let's talk about a good example. For this, let's talk about the game Good Boy. Although it's not technically a mascot horror game due to not having itself a recognizable mascot character with very clickbaitable scares, I feel like it has the most direct example I can give in regards to the concept of main and sub lore. Good Boy is a short indie horror game where you play as a young boy on their birthday. You're in a happy home with lots of toys, a loving mother, and 2 cats. However, when you go to get grandma, she gives you a very special gift for being such a good boy. A knife. No! With this, you stab the cats, stab your mom, but your grandma demands more blood, and so it ends with her calling 911 so you can murder the police. However, there are 2 other endings in this game. Instead of killing the cats, you can simply try to kill grandma, to which it's revealed that your grandma was simply a puppet for an unseen force, and by killing her, the demon demands a new host and takes you in her stead. However, if you instead turn your blade to the toy box, we are transported to the entity's domain, where we learn of many other children who were tricked by this demonic entity known as the Master. Apparently, your grandmother had bought the toy box for you, however, because it was the grandmother that used it rather than you, it was her who was swayed by the Master's influence. Upon finding the Master's heart deep in the toy box, we kill it. However, our soul remains trapped in the box for eternity. Either way, it's a short and sweet story. However, there's a rather important thing about this. It has a very distinct main and sub lore, or at the very least, that's what I'll be calling it in this video. Main lore is basically any lore you get by simply playing the game to its completion, whereas sub lore is the stuff between the lines that are found in things like notes, descriptions, secrets, and even things outside of the game like parts of an ARG, ciphers, or books. In simpler terms, main lore is what you learn just by doing random quests in Skyrim, and sub lore is the stuff in all those books that you never read. Good Boy is very clear with this. Our main lore is the game's main plot. We are a boy, and during our birthday, we are given a knife by our possessed grandma, where we can stab our family, her, or the demon in the toy box, as well as the fact that our grandmother was possessed by said toy box. The sub-lore includes the finer details, like our grandmother buying the toy box, the previous possessed kids, or even the details the game never mentioned, like what happened to our father, as he remains completely absent from the game. To get a better understanding of why this is important, let's look at an infamous example of a bad main lore sub-lore ratio. Hello Neighbor. Although we still have a good baseline, our neighbor has a suspicious basement, which we are concerned about after hearing cries for help, and so we break in. But the lore gets complicated when you try to explain further than that. Going just by what we see in the game, the neighbor was in a car crash of some kind, which we only learn about during a dream sequence. But then there's also missing children's posters that might be of his kids, so they didn't die during the car crash. And then there's something about a theme park that's briefly shown, and we get put in the basement, but then we get out, and we were a child during that first part, but now we're like an adult. And then there's a shadow guy, and he has a panic attack, and then goes home, but the shadow man calls him, oh no. And then there's this dream sequence with a classroom and a bunch of mannequins. Immediately after, there's a supermarket one, and we get shrunk a lot for some reason. And then we go to the house on his back using an umbrella, and the shadow man's following the neighbor when he puts up wanted posters and cries. But then we wake up and we're okay now. Now, I don't know a lot about the Hello Neighbor lore, but from what I've seen of both game theory and posture dissecting the TV show, there's apparently several things that just straight up aren't explained here that are explained in the books and the TV show. and everything but the games. Outside of their usual game of keep away where they almost answer a major question about the lore, only to not actually answer it, ever. Now this isn't to say that games with a complicated story are inherently bad mascot horror games. However, if you want to make a good mascot horror game, you need to follow one key rule. Upon completing the game, does your player have a basic understanding of the main plot, and do they have a starting point on which to discover the deeper lore should they so choose? And that last part is very important. Basically, a player should be able to play the entire game and feel like they understand the story on, at the very least, a basic level. But if there are deeper parts of the story, they should be introduced to it in a way that doesn't force them to understand it in order to get the basic story of the game. Knowing the sublore should be a choice, not a requirement. That's the main takeaway here. Another great example of this within Mascot Horror is Amanda the Adventure. Just by playing the game, you know the story is about a seemingly demented kid's character who can truly interact with the audience due to being a real person trapped inside who wants out. But by looking deeper, the game rewards you by telling you the circumstances around that. You don't have to know about Sam or Hamlin Entertainment or even the secret tapes to walk away from the game content. The problem with games like Hello Neighbor or Garten of Banban is that unless you've been following these games since the very beginning, it's near impossible to understand the story, especially if you are late to the party. Garten of Banban started out as a story about finding your lost child while escaping weird experimental monsters, but now it's about teaming up with them to take down the parasitic naughty ones, while Banban conflicts with the side of him that believes it's Dr. Uthman and the side of him that wants to eat your pancreas for some reason. FNAF used to be about a man who murdered 5 kids in a cheap, clunky pizzeria, only for them to possess the animatronics and seek vengeance. But now it's about mad scientists looking for immortality, Remnant, robots that look exactly like humans, time-traveling ball pits. When trying to explain the concept of your game requires several timeline videos, which are constantly changing around because of misunderstandings and retcons, then you have a massive problem that makes it near impossible to get invested with the deeper lore, which is the exact problems these games are facing. Everyone wants to be the next FNAF, the next Poppy Playtime, the next big thing, with big YouTubers making the big bucks playing your game, and channels like mine making the big bucks going over the little details to uncover the bigger story. But it's hard to want the bigger story when there is no story to begin with. Muzy became popular after Dawko made an uncharacteristically unenthusiastic title about it, calling it another mascot horror game set in a toy factory with a bootleg Huggy Wuggy. But let's say, ignoring the similarities, you wanted to get invested into the game. So what's the story just by playing? Well, there's next to none. You get a small amount of information from a very small print, hard to read contract about being a detective, and that this is a toy company called Neuroworld, where we need to get to the Maybed plant of the facility, but it doesn't really explain why, other than contract told you to. Now go pick up a gun. Despite wanting to be a lore-based game, it seemingly contradicts what little bits of information it gives us. We're at most told we're investigating because of weird noises, which would imply that the people are unaware of these living Muzys, but these creatures were clearly front and center because of this pit where the snake-like character emerges from, allowing you to play the minigame. I mean, the character Buckbeak is introduced solely for a rather generic scare, only to immediately die afterwards. But in the same breath, it shows us lore documents and scientific diagrams. But why care for the lore when the creators leave it impossible to piece anything together until you buy all 5 chapters, which don't exist yet, and judging by the reception, probably never will. Not to mention, there are several plot points that you can only learn by reading the game page description, like that the company we're investigating, Neuroworld, integrates artificial intelligence into their toys, making this more of a robots gone rogue plotline. But even in knowing this, it doesn't change anything about how you perceive the story. In this case, Muzy is an example where both the main and sub-lore are underfed, which is common in nearly every game that people title as a bootleg or a knockoff. Due to their lack of understanding with these integral parts of the genre, they come off as shallow because they're attempting to make up for a lack of direction with more characters or more dead kids. Games like Hello Neighbor, on the other hand, are an example of overbloating the sub-lore, leaving very little room to enjoy the story for how it is. And as a matter of fact, this is the exact reason that the perspective on the FNAF lore has changed so drastically. Although many people point to the kidification of horror, which to some extent is true, games like Poppy Playtime, which used to pander to the same audience, was able to get away with scenes like this. all while still being seen as a kids franchise. Like I said earlier, when it comes to FNAF, there's no real entry point if you wanted to come into the lore right now. Do you start with the games? Well, no, because a lot of it ties into the books. Should you start with the books? No, because it requires knowledge of the games or the events it references. But also, not all books are canon to the games, and not all games are canon to the books. And don't forget about the VR games, and maybe FNAF World, but wait, no, that one's not canon. And don't forget to check for teasers. And on the off chance you do cobble something together that makes sense, get ready for it to be ripped away from you in favor of a really confusing plot twist. Back between games 1 through 3, it seemed to just be a killer who murdered 5 kids that then went on to possess the suits. But then there was FNAF 4, which split the community in half over the mystery of the box, and whether or not the events of it were real or just a dream. And then there was Sister Location, which added the element of endoskeletons entering people via scooping them. And frankly, it's hard to tell where the series went wrong when it comes to its lore. But as they added bit by bit, more and more, it eventually became so overbearing that the main stories become tangled into a web so thick, even its creator admits there's no true cohesive lore timeline anymore. And by the time you reach Security Breach, if you stop paying attention to the lore after a certain point like I did, then when you eventually come back, it becomes hard to piece anything together, even when going back to learn about Help Wanted or the books. Compare this again to a good example of main lore sub-lore balance, like Slay the Princess, and you'll find that despite its seemingly complex story with dozens if not hundreds of alternate routes you can take, you can still easily get a grip on what you just played, who you were, and what you were doing without having to determine whether or not you were a robot. And the reason I keep pulling from non-mascot horror games for this is because, like my title says, most games have this problem. As a matter of fact, I'd even argue that Poppy Playtime is creeping into that category, with a book, an upcoming movie, an MMO survival game, ARGs, and more to come. If Mob Entertainment isn't careful, they may make it nearly impossible for new members of the fandom to properly create a theory without instantly being disproven by a bag of corn puffs in the background of the online multiplayer game, or the back of an NFT. Heck, I've had multiple people bring up problems with my past theories that I would only be able to know in Project Playtime by getting to a high enough level, or playing an older version. Although I may be a theorist YouTuber who has a higher chance of being willing to check for those things, other much newer theorists in the fanbase may not be as willing or even as able to go through those types of things with a fine-tooth comb. They may give up upon seeing that just playing the mainline games doesn't cut it anymore, just like they did with Hello Neighbor. To put it short, Mascot Horror has a problem with balancing the main lore with its sub-lore, oftentimes sacrificing a satisfying ending for the average player for a lore drop for the avid theorist. And in doing this, whether by oversaturating the amount of lore they have, or by not putting enough care into the average person's experience, they scare off what could be the very people to piece it together. Theorizing and communities work in tandem, so by cutting out the ability for people to even learn the lore, it becomes a net negative for everybody. For every possible theorist that gets turned away because of this, they effectively kill their game, as the theorists slowly move on to the next game until they find one with a large enough community for those theories to thrive in. If you are a developer hoping to make a good mascot horror game, you need to remember that if you were somebody who knew nothing about the lore and just picked up the game today, you need a good place to start learning the deeper story without it becoming a requirement to enjoy it. Although you can have deep and complex lore, it needs to at least be digestible if you want any hope of getting theorists in your community, which itself is the lifeblood of mascot horror. It's a paradox. If you want to pander to the theorist, do so by not pandering to them, by avoiding forcing the player to memorize it like Ban Ban or Hello Neighbor, and instead show it to the player naturally, where the deepest parts of it can be found later only if the player is truly dedicated to finding it, like Slay the Princess, or Amanda, or even classics like Mad Father or Misao. But either way, I think I've gotten my point across by now. If you like the video, like I said before, I do deep dives like this all the time, so subscribe if you're interested in that sort of thing. But otherwise, I think it's about time I head out. Peace.